We are now going to do Marine Biology Module 14, and this module deals with the deep ocean. So this will be our last, we've been working through different areas of the ocean. This will be the last one that we will cover. So let's just review. So the mesopelagic area that we looked at in the last module a little bit. So this is below the epipelagic, and in the mesopelagic area, it receives some light, however, not enough to do photosynthesis. Okay, so below the epipelagic, but not enough light, even though there is some light, not enough light for photosynthesis. So that is the mesopelagic. We'll look at each of these areas on a figure in just a minute. But then when we get to the deep sea, in the deep sea there is no light at all. So the light does not penetrate the deep sea at all. So if there is not enough light for photosynthesis, so if there's no photosynthesis, that means that there are no producers at all. So animals that are living in this area then are going to need to feed on, so they need to feed on organic matter that is produced in the photic zone. Okay, because there's no photosynthesis, therefore no producers in this area. So basically, in these areas, the organic matter is going to sink from those upper levels. And as that organic matter sinks, the organisms living in the upper levels, so the upper levels, as that organic matter sinks, they're going to feed on it first. And then the lower levels are just going to get what's left over. So by the time you get to the lower levels, they're eating the leftovers. And so there's even going to be less food available for them, less and less food available as you move to lower levels. So as you might expect, the number of organisms that are alive, that live in these areas, the number of organisms decreases with increasing depth. Okay, so the deeper the area of the ocean, the fewer organisms that live there. So let's go ahead and look at, so we know what we're talking about. So we before we did the epipelagic area, and we talked about the mesopelagic. So as we just said, in the mesopelagic, you get some light penetration, but not enough to do photosynthesis. And then anything below that, there is no light at all. Okay, so we're going to be talking about these areas here where there's not enough light for photosynthesis, and therefore you have no production taking place. If we look at the oxygen levels in this area, so we know that cold water holds oxygen better than warm water. So so this area of the ocean actually gets more oxygen than the organisms there need. So especially in areas around the North Atlantic, and Antarctica. So remember we said that cold water sinks, and then it gets circulated. It does get circulated, and you have this regular mixing, and the warm air rises. But because the cold water can hold more oxygen, there's plenty of oxygen down there for the organisms, and in fact, you'll have more than they actually need. So oxygen is not a problem for them. Okay, so let's start by talking about the organisms that live in the mesopelagic region, and then we will switch our attention to the deep sea. Okay, so mesopelagic first. So generally, in this area, we're talking about a depth of 200 to 1,000 meters. And so in this area, the organisms can see each other. So there's enough light for them to see each other. But as we said, there's not enough light for photosynthesis. This area also includes the thermocline. Remember, that goes way back to the first module. I think the first module. So this is, the thermocline is where the water temperature drops pretty dramatically. And mainly because the sun will heat the ocean, but if the sunlight is not penetrating, then you're going to end up with cold water. So the temperature in the mesopelagic region stays pretty constant. We don't see a lot of temperature change. So temperature in this region stays pretty constant. However, what we in the mesopelagic region, you do get organisms that will move up into the epipelagic. So some organisms, remember last time we talked about vertical migration. So some organisms will move sometimes into the epipelagic, and so that means that if they do that, they're going to have to deal with temperature change. So you do get some of that vertical migration. In terms of food sources in the mesopelagic, so in the mesopelagic there is no phytoplankton, okay, because they're not able to do photosynthesis, so no phytoplankton, but the zooplankton are plentiful. Many of the organisms in this in the mesopelagic area will have structures that are called photophores, and those photophores are actually used to produce light. Okay, so the photophores will be used to produce light. We look at, there's one that we are going to look at in lab that is called an ostracod. So here is a picture of an ostracod. It's a crustacean, and they can be anywhere from microscopic to up to an inch diameter. And these organisms, they tend to live on the floor of the ocean by day. So they live on the floor in the day, and then at nighttime they will rise to eat. So they will come up into the mesopelagic area to eat at night. We're going to say a little bit more about these organisms in a bit, so let's hang on to this, to that picture. In terms of predators within the mesopelagic, you will get some of the predators are in the mesopelagic are very similar to what is in the epipelagic, so you'll get things like jellyfish, comb jellies, small fish, and then two others that I'll show you some pictures of. There's something called a bristle fish, and I believe I also have a picture of a lantern fish. So let's look at these pictures. So here is a bristlemouth fish on the left and a lantern fish on the right. And the big thing that many of the animals, many of the organisms that live in this area do have photophores. And so if you look at these pictures, you can kind of see the glowing structures. And those would be due to photophores that produce the light. We'll say more about that a little bit later. In terms of where they get their food, so where does the food come from in the mesopelagic area? Well, because there are no producers, they receive their food from the epipelagic area. That area is, the epipelagic, as we said, is highly productive. And so because of that, the mesopelagic area benefits from its overproduction. However, the food is still relatively scarce in this area. And so the animals that are living there have to be able to capture as much food as they can. So let's look at some of the ways that they can do that. So capture as much food as they can. So I'll just list some of the techniques that they use. So some organisms would just sit and wait. So that doesn't use much energy. You know, if you're just sitting and waiting for stuff to come to you, it doesn't use a lot of energy. And so that's a beneficial thing is about just sitting and waiting. Some of them will have multiple arms. So again, if you have multiple arms that you can use to capture food, that's going to be a benefit. Many of them have what is called neutral buoyancy. So neutral buoyancy. And what that means is that they don't sink, so they just stay there. And they don't need to really expend any energy to stay there. They will just stay there, and it doesn't require much energy to do that. Some other techniques that are used to capture as much food as possible in this area. Many of them have long teeth. And along with that, with those long teeth, they might also have a hinged jaw, and that allows them to grasp food. So that's a desirable characteristic. And they will feed on anything they can get into their mouths. So in other words, they are not picky eaters. When food is scarce, you usually find that you're not going to be picky about what you eat. And that is true of organisms that live in the mesopelagic area. And then I already mentioned this somewhat, but some of them will do vertical migration into the epipelagic area. to eat. So often, usually that's at night, they will go up into the epipelagic area to eat at night. If we look a little bit more at the vertical migration that takes place, or that can take place, so going from the mesopelagic area up into the epipelagic area. The fish that do that, usually they have large muscles and strong bones. And partly because of that, they can tolerate changes in temperature. Not all organisms can do that. So they can tolerate temperature changes. Many of them will have a swim bladder or a air bladder that they can inflate to be able to rise to surfaces. During a full moon, they would typically not travel very high because they don't want to be seen by predators. So they would not travel too high vertically. So when we think of this vertical migration, and particularly with regard to these fish going up into to the epipelagic to eat, then when they return to the lower pelagic or the mesopelagic area, and then if they are preyed upon, then remember how we talked about how the energy gets transferred from organisms to organisms. So if these fish go into the epipelagic area and then return to the mesopelagic, then the energy that they have picked up then can also be transferred to larger organisms that would eat them. So there's some common characteristics of organisms that live in the mesopelagic area. One is that they tend to have large eyes, and some of them actually have eyes that are kind of shaped like a tube. So it kind of looks like a telescope. So that increases, they can have long range vision and can better able to capture prey. So I think I have a picture of an organism. No, that's not one. Here's one. So here's a threadtail fish that has a tubular eye, and that eye works somewhat like a telescope so that they can see long range. So large eyes in this area because it's dark and they need to be able to find food. They tend to have sensitive lateral lines. So the lateral lines can detect vibrations and no light is needed to do that. So their lateral lines are particularly sensitive. They often will have camouflage. To prevent detection by predators. And then often some of them are just transparent, so they have very little color to them, so that they can't be seen by by predators, and some are red. So red light doesn't penetrate water very well. So if there's no red light there, then red light off the fish is not going to be reflected, so they can't be seen. So transparent red light, you will see also, as we talked about last chapter, you also get some counter shading where they will be dark on top on the dorsal side, and like silver or light on the ventral side, the underside, to prevent detection. So that's in terms of their coloring. Many of them are also flattened side to side. And what that does is it prevents them from having much of a shadow or a silhouette. So again, they can prevent detection because they are very flat. And then the other thing that is common of many organisms in the mesopelagic area is that they do use bioluminescence. That's a C there. So they use bioluminescence. So this is where they can produce visible light. And in lab, we will be looking at a small sandfly that produces visible light. So as I said, for organisms that do bioluminescence, there are these special cells that are called photophores. And often the photophores will be on the underside of the body. And so that if they're viewed from above, that light on the underside is going to mix with the light from above, and you won't have a silhouette, and you'll have kind of a counter illumination, so they won't be able to see it. And so what in order to avoid detection, in total darkness, if they are in total darkness, they will turn off the light. If they are in low light, then they will glow dimly so that they will blend in with that low level light. And if they are in bright light, they will glow brightly. So the bioluminescence is what they're really trying to do is they're trying to prevent detection. So how does it work? There are several different ways that organisms can produce light. For some of them, it is the photophores just do a chemical reaction, and we'll look at that chemical reaction a little bit later. So we'll look at what that chemical reaction is. And in some of them, there is symbiosis. There's actually a symbiotic relationship between the photospores and bioluminescent bacteria. So in other words, it takes both of them working together to get these organisms benefit from the photofluorescence of the bacteria, photoluminescence, bioluminescent. And then there are others that have special glands or cells that will produce light. So it's a different type of structure than a photophore, but it basically does the same thing. It's just a special gland or a special type of cell that will produce light. So I want to look at the chemical reaction that takes place. The really interesting thing about these is they produce light, but they don't produce heat. And that is an important aspect because if heat is produced, it could damage the organism. So the fact that they can produce light but not heat is pretty important. Okay, so in these organisms, there is a protein that is called luciferin. So this is a protein. And when this luciferin reacts with oxygen, then that produces something that is called oxyluciferin. And that oxyluciferin is then it glows, it produces a light. So the problem with this is that this reaction happens very slowly, so that in order to speed it up, so to speed up this reaction, you remember from chemistry, if you've had chemistry, you use a catalyst. And often catalysts are often enzymes, and in this case, the enzyme is called luciferase. So this is the enzyme that acts as a catalyst to speed up this reaction that leads to the chemical that produces a glow. So again, no heat, it just produces light, and all they're really trying to do is they are trying to produce light to blend in with their surroundings. So they don't need a lot of light, and they don't need a bright light. And because they're living in colder water, the reaction is going to happen more slowly. So they're going to produce a dimmer light. But if they're in brighter light, they have the ability to produce a brighter light. but it's in a very efficient process, and in fact, about 80% of the energy that is used actually produces light. In humans, most of the things that we do in terms of our making machines and things like that, most of our things are about 20% efficient, which means that only about 20% of the energy actually goes to doing anything useful. These have been shown to be about 88% efficient. So only about 12% of the energy actually gets wasted and doesn't go into producing light. So there is an organism, a little thing that's called an ostracod. These are nicknamed sea fireflies. And in lab, we will, there's a chemical in those. And then we mix those with water. So chemical in the firefly. And when we mix that with water, here's where that oxygen comes from the water. And then that will produce the bioluminescence. It will produce the shining light. You also have to put energy in here. So when we do it in class, you'll actually slide a glass slide back and forth. And when you do that, that's providing the energy for the reaction. So the oxygen comes from the water, and you're just helping to release that chemical that is in the ostracod. So again, they mainly use the bioluminescence for camouflaging and to prevent, to get away from predators, to prevent detection from predators. However, they sometimes can use it to identify members of their own species. So they would, some organisms will recognize a member of their own by the bioluminescence that is emitted, and they'll also use them for defense. So we've talked earlier about how octopus and squid will produce ink, and that is a form of bioluminescence, and they will use that for defense. Okay, so that is all we are going to say about the mesopelagic area. So now let's switch and let's talk about the deep sea. So in the deep sea, no sunlight penetrates at all. So it's always dark and it's always cold. And the salinity is pretty constant. So there aren't temperature variations or salinity variations that have to be dealt with. However, the big thing that we have to deal with in the deep sea is pressure. So as you can imagine, the organisms that are living in the deep sea have the pressure of all the water that is above them. So organisms, we said this earlier, organisms generally can only tolerate certain temperature ranges and certain pressure ranges. So the organisms will live only in those areas where they can tolerate the pressures. So with regard to with regard to the pressure changes. So the deep sea is divided into bathypelagic, abyssopelagic, and hadopelagic. And really the big difference between organisms that live in these areas are the pressures that they can tolerate. So they will tend to live in an area that has pressure that they can tolerate, and they don't move much between these levels because they can't they live within a fairly narrow pressure range. So pressure is the big thing. So so different organisms live at different depths depending on the pressures that they are able to tolerate. So let's look at some of the characteristics of organisms that live in the deep ocean. Well, first of all, many of them are gray in color. And in the deep ocean, many of them are actually black. They do have bioluminescence. They're going to have predators down there just like any other area, and so they will use bioluminescence to escape predators, but they will also use it to locate prey, and they'll use it for finding mate. So it's also important for mating. As you can imagine, they have small eyes or even no eyes because there's no light. And with regard to the food, even less food gets to these areas because every other as the food has had to move its way down the water column from the photic zone, and other organisms have taken their part of it before it ever gets to this deep sea. Another factor for organisms living in here is, and I've already mentioned this somewhat, they cannot vertically migrate. So they can't move up into the mesopelagic area or the epipelagic area just because they can't tolerate those changes in pressure. They are made to live within a certain pressure range and they can't move out of that. Because food is scarce, they will use means to conserve food. So generally, these organisms are very small. They move slowly because it takes less energy to move slowly than if you're moving fast. The muscles tend to be kind of watery and weak. So that also would mean that they would use less energy. If you're not getting much food, you need to conserve energy as much as possible. They have big mouths, and that's because they need to eat whatever prey they can. And so some of the animals are basically just a mouth and a stomach. So big mouth and then some way to digest and deal with that with the food. Some of the organisms in the deep ocean So you can imagine that because there aren't as many organisms living in the deep ocean, in order to reproduce, it might be difficult to find another member of their species. So many of them are hermaphrodites. So in other words, when it's time to mate, they just need to find another member of their own species. They don't have to find a male or a female. Like a male doesn't have to find a female and a female find a male, because all they have to do is find another member of their species, just another fish of their species. If they are not hermaphrodites, then they will tend to use bioluminescence to find a mate, or in some cases they also will emit a smell. And so this can help them to find a mate if they're not a hermaphrodite. One interesting thing that we see in these large fish is actually something, or in these fish that live in the deep ocean, is something that's called male parasitism. And there is a type of fish that is called an anglerfish. And what the male bites into the female. And then the female blood vessel is actually attached to the male, and the male stays there for the rest of his life on the female. So they basically have a mate for life. So the male gets nutrition from the female, and then they can reproduce. So it's a form of parasitism, but it's a way that these types of fish can reproduce. I don't know if I have a picture of. Yeah, so here's a. This is on the right is the anglerfish, and so that type of fish, the male will bite into the female and actually attach to the female's blood vessels and feed from the female, but then they can also mate, or they have a mate for life. In the deep sea, the animals that live here, they lay large eggs, and those large eggs have large yolks. So the larva will eat that yolk until they are big enough to eat bigger creatures. So it's a way of sustaining life for a longer period of time before they need to try to find larger animals to eat. And they also in the deep sea, they tend to lay only a few eggs at a time. Because remember, every time, all that takes energy. It takes energy to produce and lay eggs. And if you're in a situation where you don't have as much energy, you try to conserve that as much as possible. So in the deep sea, we see that the organisms, they grow slowly. They have a low metabolic rates. They have low body temperatures. And all of this is a way for them to deal with the fact that there is a low food supply. So they need to try to conserve as much of that food supply as they can. And because of these things, as far as we know, they probably live a long time. Even though they don't have much food, they have ways of conserving that food, and they probably live a long time. It is difficult to study the deep ocean because of the high pressure. So we now have submerged vehicles that can withstand the pressure. But the problem is that if you remove an organism from its environment to study it, then you've changed the pressure that is on that organism. And so that's going to change the way the body functions, and it'll probably die. So we need to be able to study these fish in their environment. And that's been difficult to do. We can submerge a vehicle, but then, typically we have brought those animals up to study, and then you don't really get much in the way of useful information. In terms of how the animals feed, so food settles on the bottom, so it food settles on the bottom, and it will tend to stay there until it is found. And so the animals are constantly patrolling the bottom of the ocean floor to find food. So they'll find constantly patrolling the bottom for food. So they will find bacteria. They'll find the remains of skeleton that might not be easy for them to digest, but bacteria can break it down. So most of them obviously are deposit feeders. They're just feeding, on the stuff that has been deposited on the ocean floor. Some of the predators in this area are things like crabs and sea stars and squid and fish. There's not a lot of food, so even the predators in this area are pretty much scavengers, and they'll eat whatever they can find. We'll finish with this. One interesting thing about the deep ocean is that there have been found some pretty giant organisms that live here. there's some giant fish, but generally what has been found is giant crabs and giant squid. And they can be up to like 10 times larger than other organisms that are living where they are living, or organisms that are living in more shallow water. So the interesting thing about them is that, if it's assumed that if there is scarce food, that that usually means smaller organisms. And so scientists don't really have a good explanation for how these organisms can grow so large. Some of the, some suggestions they have are those things that we talked about earlier, that because they grow slowly, they have low metabolic rates, they have low body temperatures, and that allows them to live for longer periods of time, and maybe that is why they're able to grow so large. Okay, so that is all we are going to talk about in Module 14. There's a bit of the end of the chapter that we didn't get to on hydrothermal vents, but I think we covered enough of the material that we need to in Module 14.